This is my t-shirt pattern and I'm going to show you how I made this shirt. To start, you need to cut your pattern from the silk lining. The first thing you want to do is to test the stretch, because the stretch has to go sideways. Trace your pattern onto the paper side of the lining you are using. The top side of the pattern faces up. There will be no seam allowances on the lining. You can cut out the lining at the traced lines. There's only one sleeve pattern, but you need 2 sleeves. You have to cut the pattern twice. You want to place one side of the sleeve pattern onto the parchment paper side of the lining and flip it to trace the other side. Make sure that the stretch goes sideways here as well. Now you have your pattern and the cutout pattern pieces are lying in front of you. The fabric has a front side and a back side. You want to place the lining on the bottom side of the fabric. Check the grain line and the stretch. The grain line runs vertical and the stretch will be horizontal. Trace the outlines of your pattern onto the back side of the fabric using a heat erasable pen. You have to flip the pattern since the backside represents the backside of the fabric. Take extra care while tracing around the pattern and make sure the fabric does not shift underneath. This is the time you need to add seam allowance. You want to leave at least 1 centimeter in between the pattern pieces to be extra safe. You want to trace the sleeve twice too. Now you want to place the lining inside the traced lines. You can do that by scoring the back of the parchment paper in 2 places on the back side of the lining. Use the blunt side of the X-Acto knife. This breaks the surface and you can pop it open carefully to peel the middle part off. Then place the backing inside the traced lines. Doing it this way helps placing the backing without distortion. Also, it's fun to pop parchment paper. Carefully take off the remaining parchment paper and place the outer parts of the lining onto the fabric. After you placed all your lining pieces inside the traced lines, you need to stabilize the seam allowance. Do that by brushing the white glue right on the edge of the seam allowance. I like to use high tack. Use a flat, thin, sharp-edged brush and make sure not to get any glue onto the lining itself. Brush the glue around all edges, including the hemlines. Let the glue dry and cut out the pieces at about 3 or 4 millimeters from the edge around the lining. You want to leave a little bit more at the hemlines, about 5 millimeters. In costume fabrication for stop-motion animation, we finish the seams before sewing the costumes together. We fold the seam allowances onto the lining, holding them down with a little bit of glue and some pressure of the iron. To avoid material buildup at the edges, you can cut them in a 45-degree angle. Cut off the edges on the underarm and both shoulder points. Leave the hemlines and neckline open for now. Everywhere where there's a curve, we have to release the tension that would occur when folding the seam allowance. To release the tension, cut into the seam allowances in several spots. I marked them here before I cut into the seam allowance. Be careful not to cut too close to the lining or into the lining itself, as it will create a weak spot. Use some glue again to fold back the seam allowance onto the lining and press it down gently. Use your judgment on the amount of glue you use. Keep in mind that glue strengthens and restricts the material and the movement. Use as much as you need and as little as possible. Turn and fold the side seam. At this time, you want to close the other side seam. The back stitching. I am threading my needle to show you how I close the side seam. First, make a knot at the end of your thread. You can do any knot you want. To close the side seam, place a pin right at the top of the seam. Align the uppermost corners of the lining. You will stitch along the edges of the lining. Place your first pin. Do the same at the end of the side seam. Align the bottom corners of the lining and place your second pin. Now you can align the sides and place a third pin about halfway along the seam. Start stitching on the very top of the highest point of the side seam. I am using a contrast colored thread to make it obvious for you to see. Obviously, you want to use a color matching your fabric. Secure your first stitch. Do that by stitching in from the front. Then stitch about 2 millimeters further down to the front again. From the front, stitch through your very first stitch you took, and now your thread is on the back. Begin your first stitch. Start the first stitch by turning your piece again. Stitch from the back to the front about 2 millimeters further down than the last stitch you made. Pull the needle and the thread to the front and pull taut. In the front, you want to stitch 2 millimeters higher up again. This will look like going backwards again. Pull the thread to the back and pull taut. The next stitch from the back side will be even further down the seam. Stick to the 2 millimeter increments and stitch forward and backwards in this manner until you reach the end of the seam at the bottom. Kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. It's called the back stitch. At the end of the seam, stitch just a little bit further at the edge of the lining. Stitch this stitch twice and do your securing stitch here. Secure your thread by stitching through the thread at the end when it forms a tiny loop. Pull taut. When you turn the piece, you should see that you have stitched right along the edges of the lining in a straight line. Fold the seam allowances of the side seam to the sides. Brush some high tack onto the seam allowance before pressing them to the sides. You can use the iron to heat set the glue. In miniature costume fabrication, we do this to flatten the seam transitions. At this time, you want to turn and fold all the other seam allowances to finish the edges. The only seams that are not finished are the hemline and the neckline. Cut into the seam allowances to release the tension where needed and use the same technique to press them back onto the lining. Here you see why we cut the 45-degree angled corners. This way, you can fold the seam allowances onto the silk lining and avoid material build up in those corners. You want to be careful to not cut too much of the edge or you will create a weak spot. The sleeve has 2 kinds of curves, an inward curve and an outward curve. The inward curve needs to be cut into at the seam allowance in the same way we cut into the armhole curve at the seam allowance. The arch of the sleeve, on the other hand, is curved outwards. If you turned the seam allowance onto the backing without cutting away some of the excess material, it would create a wavy fold. To avoid that, cut triangles out of the arch seam allowance. You can cut a stencil from a thick cardboard to press the top edge of the sleeve. Using stencils is a great technique for any curve. Curves tend to expand or stretch while folding. Using a stencil helps keep the integrity of your piece. Take the stencil off and use great care to fold the seam allowance onto the backing. Secure with a little bit of glue. Fold the underarm seam allowance onto the backing and leave the hemline open for now. Your bodice piece is done and at this point should look like this. One seam is closed. You have finished the side seams, the armhole and the shoulder seams. The neckline is still open. Both sleeves are finished and ready. Now you can turn the hems. Fold and turn the hems of bodice and sleeve. After folding them, you can place the decorative top stitching. Prepare for the top stitching on the hemline. Mark 3 mm increments on the back of your hem. Place the marks about 2 mm from the edge. Thread your needle and tie a knot. Start your first stitch by stitching into the first mark from the back. Stitch into the front. This is a back stitch with a little bit more spaced out stitches. It is the same principle. Stitch backwards on the front about 2 mm. Turn your piece and stitch into the next mark you have made on the back of the hem. Do the same thing to your sleeve hem. The neckband is like a tunnel. You want to fold the size onto the back to create a strip that you can shape and bend before placing it on the neckline seam allowance. Use a strip of freezer paper to help you stabilize the fabric from the top. Freezer paper or butcher paper is amazing because it has a side that sticks to paper when ironed on. This will help you keep the fabric in place while working on it. It helps with precision and has many applications. Place it on the top of your fabric. Press it on using a piece of parchment paper on top. The freezer paper now sticks securely and you can brush some high tack onto the sides. Press down the sides with parchment paper and heat to compress the fiber. This decreases the volume of the material and the thickness. Sandwich the piece in between two pieces of parchment paper and run your iron along the edge, applying a good amount of pressure. Do this on both sides. Cut away the excess fabric to about 2 mm on each side. Carefully brush some high tack onto the center part of the back of the band. This is to support and stabilize the trim. Let the glue air dry. Turn and fold the sides to the back of the trim. You can use a ruler to create a crisp edge. Run your iron along the edge of the ruler. Turn your piece and apply a little bit of high tack to the fold. Carefully fold it down and make sure you keep the integrity and crispness of the straight line. To set the glue, you can press along the edge once more using a piece of parchment paper on top. Do the same thing for the other side. And you'll have this really nice neckband. Start manipulating the neckband in a way so that it fits into the curve of the neckband. For the next step, you'll need to mark the position of the neckband. A great way to mark the position is to run a running stitch along the edge of the lining on the back of the shirt. A running stitch really looks like it sounds, running in and out of the surface in a line. A big problem in stop-motion animation costume fabrication is the scale of the fabric and the material buildup caused by the seam allowances. One way of working with this is to flatten the seam allowance. Brush some glue onto the seam allowance, just barely close to the running stitch. Be careful here not to touch the marking thread. Glue will make it difficult to pull out. This will create a very thin, stabilized seam allowance where the neckband can sit in. Pull the thread out. The t-shirt is now ready for assembling. The sleeves are prepared as well and have to sit in the armhole like this. In a production setting, we would stitch the costume onto the puppet. We can't dress a puppet like a human being. That is why we have to stitch the costume onto the puppet. We would do that by closing the side seam and the shoulder seams. The sleeves would be stitched on after the bodice is assembled on the puppet. Since you don't have a puppet, I show you how to do this without a puppet. To stitch a costume from the outside, we are using the invisible stitch. I threaded my needle again with a contrasting thread for you to see better what I'm doing. Make a knot at the end of your thread. Secure your thread in the back about 2 mm from the bottom edge. Close your side seam at the bottom to align the two sides at the bottom edges. Stitch into the side seam of the other side. You want to stitch inside the fold, just along the edge to the end of the seam. Pull these two pieces together and turn your piece. Stitch from the bottom along the edge of the fold to the point where you started your first stitch. Stitch into the edge of the fold of the opposite side again and catch the edge with your needle to make a stitch about 2 mm. Pull your thread to the other side to know exactly where you have to place your next stitch. Stitch into the side you are now on and catch the edge of the fold for about 2 mm to make your second stitch. Go back to the other side, catch the fold for about 2 mm to make your third stitch, and you already see how it's going. Basically, you want to be catching the side seam edges and pull them together. Make your way all the way up the side seam to the underarm. When you reach the underarm point, you can turn your piece and catch the other side to create a final double stitch. Create a nice transition. At this point, it already looks like a t-shirt. It's only missing the neckband and the sleeve. To attach the neckband, apply a little bit of high tack to the edge of the seam allowance. Place the neckband very carefully. I use tweezers to help me press the neckband down and in place. Proceed like that all the way around. Gently position the neckband along the edge you created so that it looks even and nice. Where the two ends meet, cut the excess strip and connect the two edges with a little bit of glue. You will need to do some securing stitches in a later step. Carefully shape your neckband. The collar needs to be stitched down to the t-shirt with an invisible stitch. We do this to pull these two elements together and to create a more natural look that is to scale. Use an invisible stitch again. I am using beading needles size 13. Stitch into the collar from the inside of the t-shirt to make your first stitch. For these delicate visible parts of the costume, you want to take extra care. Do even stitches and do them in a way that is most invisible. Always catch the exact same amount of ribs of the neckband. Check your stitch length. You need to pull the thread tight enough for both pieces to connect. If you pull too much, you will create a wavy texture. I like to press my thumbs over the stitch while pulling to avoid the waving. As you can see, I actually created a little wavy texture. I am not too bothered about it this time. See if you can do it without the wavy look. Make your way around the neckline like this until you reach the point where the neckband connects. Finish off your work on the neckband by putting some securing stitches at the connection. Try weaving these two pieces together. You can do this in any way you want. Just make sure that it's not visible and that the thread goes from one side to the other, connecting the two pieces. And this is the bodice. Now you only need to attach the sleeves. Close the underarm seam with an invisible stitch in the same way you close the side seam. With tiny pieces like this, I like to help myself using round-shaped objects like a brush. For the last step, you need to stitch the sleeve into the armhole. The problem here is that everything is so small and that our fingers can't really help anymore. Usually, the puppet would hold the costume in place. Because you don't have a puppet, you will need some filling material to help building a shape to fill the space. What you use doesn't really matter. You can use some tissue paper that you fold in the shape of a sleeve or use some foam. Position the sleeve in the armhole and mark the areas where the sleeve has to meet the bodice with pins. Use an invisible stitch and start stitching at the top of the underarm seam. Secure your thread again by making a tiny securing stitch. Catch the folded seam allowances of the armhole and the sleeve to connect them. Stitch along around the armhole. It is important to always check the position of your sleeve before you place the stitches. I do this every stitch I take and I reposition my sleeve to make sure that I place the stitches in the right place. Do not misalign the sleeve, it happens easily. The sleeve is now stitched on. You can take out your filling material and stitch on the second sleeve in the same way. Congratulations, you did it. You made a miniature t-shirt. You learned most of the fundamental stitching and fabrication techniques we use in miniature costume fabrication. At any time you can add finishing touches like paint or print to your t-shirt. I gave my shirt this iron-on applique.